Good morning and welcome everyone. I see our attendees are coming in, so we'll give it just another minute to allow everyone to log on with us before we get started. Okay, so I think we can go ahead and get started. And we want to welcome everyone today to our webinar where we will be talking about data stewardship with rare disease data. So welcome everyone to today's, the last final RDCA-DAP webinar of the 2022 series. So just a couple housekeeping items before we introduce our speakers for today. So for all of the attendees, if you have questions for our speakers and panelists, please feel welcome to put those questions in the Q&A chat. So at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, and that's where you can put any questions. Please make sure when you're sending your questions that you choose the all panelists so that we can make sure that they're seen by everyone who's joining us on the panel today. I also just want to announce that this presentation is being recorded so that we'll make it available on our C-Path YouTube channel after the fact. So anyone who wasn't able to join us today will still be able to watch the webinar. And I think that's it for housekeeping. So at this point, I want to move to the important things, which is introducing our presenters today. So we are really thrilled to have two really great speakers with us today. Joining us is William Roddy. He currently leads the C-Path Institute's data engineering team and develops tooling to support the moving and processing of data from a diversity of data sources with a focus on extracting evidence to improve patient care. Currently, Mr. Roddy focuses on developing the data pipeline and platform for the RDCA-DAP project, and really leveraging the data in the areas of rare diseases, as well as complications of premature birth. So we're thrilled to have Mr. Roddy here with us today. Our second presenter is Dr. Casey Baker. She joined the National Organization for Rare Disorders, also known as NORD, in 2021 as the Associate Director of Technology. In this role, she develops and implements strategies, tools, and standards around the data collection, security, and analysis supporting NORD's research programs and collaborations. So she works with us on the RDCA-DAP platform and the data that we're bringing in the area of rare disease. And so we're thrilled to have her joining us today as well. So at this point, I want to go ahead and turn it over to our presenters to take it away. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Laura. I'm just get a confirmation you guys can see the slides. So I think that it's helpful when we talk about data stewardship to remind ourselves what the kind of driving factor here is. And one of the main principles that we really are interested in C-Path, especially RDCA-DAP, is enabling the fair data principles. And the idea here is that when it comes to data management and stewardship, we want to ensure that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And that the driving factors that we want to be able to ensure the longevity of data by letting both humans and computers find it, that data should be accessible, stored in a format that people can actually access it, that it's interoperable, so it doesn't matter what software or programming language you're using, you're able to actually access that data and use it. So not storing things on floppy disks, for example, and that data should be reusable. There needs to be enough information that you can actually be able to utilize that data. And it may not be exactly obvious why this is related to data stewardship at first blush, but if we take a look back at the original journal article, the original publication that described the fair-heading principles for data management and stewardship, it's actually right in the title. The data stewardship is a component of this. And the authors go so far, they call out that data stewardship includes a notion of the long-term care of valuable digital assets. And that should be whether they're discovered and reused alone or in combination with newly generated data in the future. And this is one of the core components of RDCA data. So we want to ensure that the data that we have is cared for in such a fashion that you could use that data set alone or with new data sets that haven't even been collected yet. And so this good stewardship of data is a precondition for supporting knowledge discovery and innovation. It's a prerequisite for proper data management and stewardship. That is the component of fairness here. And although it's helpful to know that it's related to fairness, it still doesn't really exactly define what is data stewardship. And the precise definitions vary. There was a ARC did an RFI in 2007, and the responses included a huge range of viewpoints. And it's an expansive role. It really depends kind of on the field, what role, what kind of sector you're in. There's a lot of different factors that go into determining the exact role of what a data steward is. But there's some common themes around management of data, support for future use, and a really strong emphasis on trusted relationships. In one piece, it's described as having an approach to data management, especially that can identify individuals, and that the data steward is intended to convey a fiduciary relationship whose loyalty is to the interests of individuals. And so as data stewards, we want to ensure that we're representing the patients and the caregivers especially. And that when this comes to health information, it compels data stewards to have trust and competency. We need to adopt new technology, and we need to adopt new models for data exchange that include the patient as part of the data supply chain. And so where this really relates to fairness is we want to make sure that data is findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, but we also want to be representing the interests of the individuals, and the data stewards in this capacity have a trust relationship with those individuals that we're representing their desires. And so we can boil this down to three characteristics of data stewardship. Those characteristics are largely the fiduciary relationship and responsibility, where we ensure privacy, we represent the interests of individuals, we comply with legal and regulatory requirements, and we manage access and security. Those legal and regulatory requirements are going to vary by jurisdiction. It can be everything as small as the jurisdiction of a state in the United States, or as large as groupings of countries such as the European Union. We also have the fairness of these data, that they're accessible, the annotation and preservation of them. So we create and maintain and publish dictionaries and metadata to ensure that fairness. And then we have the duration aspects of these that really connect the middle ground between that fiduciary relationship and the fairness, where we adopt the interoperable technology, we standardize our data for future reuse, we adopt new models for data exchange, and we do an assessment of the data quality, make sure that the data that we're representing and giving to researchers is the highest quality data to make insights and translate these data into evidence. I think another term that's used to call out is data governance. And I frequently hear these two terms conflated, but there is a slight difference between data governance and data stewardship. And the kind of broad idea of data governance is this is the framework under which data stewardship is executed. So it's an umbrella of activities that encompasses stewardship. And it can be defined as the policies and approaches that enable stewardship. So they should establish these policies around permissible uses of data, methods and procedures that are necessary for the stewardship process. It also establishes qualifications and the conditions under which access to those data can be granted. So it really begins to define the pragmatic components of how we execute data stewardship. It's a decision-making activity, and it's an authority around data-related matters. So we have a system of decision-related rights that describe the actions with what information and when and what circumstances and using what methods data stewardship can be executed. And so we can think of the relationship between data stewardship and governance as the 3 Ps, where we have the policies, which are what do we need to do, the processes, which is what is required to comply with the policy, and the procedures, which are how should the tasks be carried out. And the relationship between these is that in data governance, we define the 3 Ps. We answer what is it that we need to do, what is it that is required to comply with that policy, and then what are the tasks that should be carried out. And then in stewardship is where we actually execute those, where we ensure that we're complying with the policy, that we're following the processes that would comply with that policy, and that our processes are driven by procedures to support those. So I think it's helpful to look at an example of these. One example where we see policy to procedures is with the identification. So we may have a data policy that says the data should be de-identified per HIPAA guidelines. It's a very good policy. It's something that's set by data governance. But we then define the process. The process that we enable that policy is that we say we will de-identify data using safe harbor. And then the procedure for using safe harbor is that the technical staff remove or replace all 18 HIPAA identifiers from the data before sharing it with somebody externally. So here we've given everything from what is the policy that we need to follow down to the detail of how do we actually execute on this. And so governance answers questions like, does this give data stewards sufficient guidance to do their jobs? Is this acceptable given institutional policies, the relevant regulations, laws? Are all the parties, patients, researchers, custodians, lawmakers in agreement that these 3 Ps are sufficient for what the needs of the respective stakeholders are? And it also answers, is governance plan feasible given the data? Understanding what the data source is a big component of really understanding, can we actually execute on these 3 Ps? This is particularly important in the rare disease space. And stewardship addresses questions like, how do I support knowledge discovery and innovation and complete this procedure? Recognizing that this should be driving the fairness of data, but also we need to make sure that we're complying with these. So we then ask questions like, what identifiers do exist in the data? What data elements can be replaced instead of removed? How can I remove these under safe harbor? And finally, does the data meet the policy intent of safe harbor? And this is a big part of the data stewardship, where we really look at what is the sort of intent of the law and less of what is the letter of the law. We want to make sure that even if we're checking all the boxes, are we really meeting the intention of the policy and what the stakeholders were meaning by those data governance practices? So just to give you some idea, there are these tensions in data stewardship that exist between these different stakeholders. We have patients, custodians, stewards, and researchers, and we all want the same outcome, that we're representing the patient, that we're delivering better evidence, that we're developing new research that helps the patient's life. But mechanisms of how we get to that endpoint are debated, and that's because of this exhaustive list, and I won't go through all of them, but it's a good example is the right to grant and deny permissible data access and reuse. And so a patient may want to let their data be used very freely, but it doesn't align with the institution's policies or potentially even with their local jurisdiction's policies. On the other hand, we may have the opposite extreme where patients are okay with reuse under certain situations, but researchers want to share that data more broadly because they think there's really important insights there. And so we have to strike a healthy balance where we're being pragmatic about granting access, that we're actually allowing for data to be fair and that researchers can utilize it, while at the same time that we're not placing, we're not losing sight of what that data governance policy was. And so I think a good way to think about this is that data stewardship is a team sport. There's a lot of people that are involved in this, there's a lot of different personas. Behind me, there's a whole team of people that is responsible for helping make sure that we actually are acting on the data stewardship components here. And so for the research domain, we have data scientists and scientists that help align on the data policies. We have infrastructure, the technicians, IT personnel, infrastructure providers who help align on the data infrastructure, kind of physical storage. And then we have the policy aspect of this that helps align on the data services, the policymakers, funders, that help really bring all of these people together. And without having every unique stakeholder, we're not successful in data stewardship. So it's really important that we bring all of these individuals together. Which I think is a nice segue. I'm going to hand this over to Dr. Baker here in a moment. She's going to talk a little bit about, practically speaking, what does data stewardship look like at NORM.
Thank you, Will. You can move to the next slide. So as Will mentioned, data stewardship is a team sport, and one of the most important team members for us is the patient groups. So our patient groups come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. We have groups that are already interacting with researchers and looking to move to the next step. We also have groups that are just a handful of parents who are trying to dip their toe into what research looks like in collecting data because they have children that they're looking to contribute data on, contribute their experience on. So one of the first steps in establishing this is meeting them where they are. So listening to their needs and their goals. These different size groups have different things that they are looking for, and they have different areas that they find valuable. So the other half is sharing. So NORD has 40 years, will have 40 years of experience in working with the rare disease community. So it's that experience that we bring to working with the groups and making sure that we can collaborate together to build the studies and surveys to make sure that everybody is getting what they are looking for and that it's in an organized manner to be shared appropriately. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, data stewardship really starts from generation and usage to analysis. This is the basis for thoughtfully building the studies and surveys. So our research team works closely with these patient groups to bring awareness to all of these different aspects that are surrounding the data. It can shape the data, and conversely, this can shape how we collect the data and want to feedback into how we change or alter our designs for any of these areas. So one example would be compliance. So regulations may determine what data we can collect from different people, and conversely, the type of data that we end up collecting in whatever format may drive which policies that we need to start to apply to ensure we are compliant. Content would be another one. So the data that we are collecting, maybe it will drive another survey or more information that's of interest, and we could design another survey to dive deeper into some of that information and collect something that may be very valuable. So again, it is that collaboration together that ensures we balance these considerations with the unique needs and goals of the group with how we should structure governance at the study level. So as stewards of patient data, governance helps to implement and reinforce the procedures developed, and it helps to provide definition and consistency that's important for maintaining the data security and quality amongst other things. Next slide. So our work with the patient groups is just the beginning in some ways when it comes to the RDC Adapt. So after we set up their governments and their surveys and their studies, the group can launch and they have a registry. They can start collecting data. And so we store this data in our database, and then from there is the beginning to processing it and getting it into the RDC Adapt if they agree to contribute some of their data. So next we need to make this information shareable. So what we have designed is for them to view what they're interested in, but what does this look like for other people? So in partnership with C-Path, we've created processes and structure to ensure that the critical data aspects are preserved within these areas. So data quality, standardization, accuracy, usability, and the privacy and security move from collection within the patient group's registry all the way through to the RDC Adapt. So a simple example would be secure transfer of data extracts in a compatible format. So making sure that we pull it out of the registries and the surveys into a format that can be ingested, read, and usable in the RDC Adapt platform. Another one that was a little bit more complex than we thought it would be is the standards for date shifting. So in looking at the information, we realized that a lot of the important time points were valuable in establishing timelines and establishing how disease progresses and establishing how treatments are affecting patients. So because this is identifying information, we came up with a formula to be able to shift these dates so some of the durations and periods were preserved within this data for people to use without sacrificing the privacy of the individuals contributing the information. So it's a collaborative effort that touches on all the aspects. So this is what feeds back into our expertise and experience, again, for guiding the groups as we learn from these things in working with C-Path and contributing to the RDC Adapt for making sure that we build from the start to accommodate for some of these things that we've learned. Next slide. So again, collaborating together, so collaborative curation, as I'd mentioned, making sure that even though we have all of this information, that we're transferring it into a format that's still usable and is still very informative to all of the collaborators. So balancing the elements of what the patient groups are looking for, what they need, their policies and procedures, with how we submit these files, formats, and updates to the RDC Adapt. So it's this shareability that's really important for us to work together. So part of that is having a common understanding. So this may be as simple as establishing common language, which I say this and kind of laugh, but it does get pretty complicated. So for example, response time. If you're looking at response time of a survey, one could interpret that as how long it takes an individual to complete the survey, or the response time could actually be the timestamp of when that survey was submitted. So in working together with these groups and working with C-Path, we make sure that we look at some of these aspects and make sure that we're all on the same page where possible. Doesn't mean that we don't learn along the way some of these areas, because there are always different surveys, different ways to collect things, and different things that people are looking for. So taking the lessons learned from each iteration and applying them moving forward for the projects and mechanisms for prevention and others is what's very important in this continuous improvement, which is really key for stewardship. As you know, this is a really quickly evolving area, and being able to be nimble and being able to work together on this is what really drives and makes us successful. Next slide. Oops, sorry, forgot about the animation. It's okay. Go ahead. Yep.
Okay. Thanks, Casey. So I think that gives a really good summary of what the data stewardship looks like when you're housed pretty close to the patient and the patient group. But the other aspect of this is, how do we actually connect that data to the researcher? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we finish the next half of the life cycle of the data over here at C-Path. So our data collection process is that we have the input, which in the case of NORD and IMRARE are patient registries, but we do this with other types of data as well. And our process is that we contact the custodian, we negotiate a data sharing agreement. We do this with each individual registry group that Casey was describing. We transfer the data in a secure fashion. We do some exploration and mapping, where we then make that data available for the custodian's direction. And that helps generate feedback that we get back to the patient groups and to NORD, that iterative process around this. We standardize the data, and we develop analysis and tools. And we also provide larger data sets when appropriate. And so one component to this is the sort of stewardship aspect of allowing for tiers of sharing levels and pathways, where there's a dial that we can adjust about how much data sharing we want. That could be everything down from maybe it's just shared with C-Path internally, down to shared with anyone on the internet. We recognize that there's lots of different use cases, and we want to support those. Of course, in the interest of trying to make that data accessible, we want it to be shared with as many people as possible. So we really try to encourage that. But we also recognize that it's important that we're reflecting the desires of the patient, and that we're reflecting the desires of the data custodian. So we do have a data use committee that RDC-Data provides. And that data use committee will review requests to see if it's appropriate given the context of the data. If in the data answer the question, are they requesting the right data set? Not necessarily looking quite at the scientific merit, but making sure that what is being asked for is appropriate given the context. This data use committee does a lot of work. We work very closely with them to make sure they're getting the right information ahead of time, but that also follows on making sure that we're following those conditions of use before we give any data to a researcher. The other aspect of this, as far as following specific procedures, or as far as the 3Ps go, is creating metadata that is used to enable discoverability in the RDC-Data. And so we have this kind of swim lane model, and the details of it are really in the weeds, and I don't necessarily want to focus too much on it, but I just want to show this as an example of internal documentation that we have to really outline as far as what is our process and procedures that our data curators, our data management, our data engineering staff follow very closely to ensure that we're actually executing on the policies that are defined. And so this is really the procedure that we have to enable reuse. It requires input from custodian and multiple C-Path department. That these swim lanes are different stakeholders and their roles in this process. It's not one individual, it's a whole team of us that are able to enable the sharing of these data, but also making sure that we're following the stewardship guidelines and making that data really fair for the best interest of the research. And so kind of looking at some of the unique steps when we're thinking about the curation stewardship process, one of the first things that we do is make sure the data received matches the data in the agreements. We don't want there to be the accidental file that was included in a transfer and should have been excluded or something along those lines. We review for PHI, PII, make sure we don't disclose any of that information incidentally. We reformat the data structure. We extract the metadata for annotations. It's sort of like AC was saying, there's a lot of nuances around what is response time. So we've worked very closely with board to receive that data in a fashion that we have a lot of rich metadata that we can create data catalogs and dictionaries from. But we also recognize that the format that we get that data in is maybe not the most step-level format. It's not something that's super easy to search for. It's not something that's going to be really easy to analyze. So instead, we take that data, we structure it in a format that we think is easier to find within our platform. And that we believe is easier for a researcher to actually be able to understand, or for a patient to even come to look and see what data is available in our ecosystem. And we publish all of those data for our platform, the RDCA-Data various services. It's this joint responsibility really between the life cycle of connecting the patient to the researcher with this unique relationship between the RDCA-Data and board is a joint responsibility on representing the patient, tracking privacy, ensuring compliance, ensuring security of the data. We share in this shared verification of that data with the discoverability of it by annotation of metadata and data, which is leading to that long-term preservation and reusability and ultimately driving data sharing. And this is a really iterative process where we apply common data models, we apply common models for data exchange, we standardize the data elements themselves, and we ensure that data quality. Again, really trying to represent what was the original intention of the question, so that when the researcher comes, they are able to understand what the patient meant when they responded to something. And that's a pretty tricky problem. And so when we look at this shared partnership, we have the Nord stewardship team that extracts the metadata, and the data. They work with the patient group to collect it to begin with. They transfer it to us. We further curate that data. We publish it for reviews, where we provide feedback that goes back to Nord into the patient registry on how they can continue to enhance both the metadata and the data themselves for research use cases. It's kind of drawing a line between our two groups. We have these shared stewardship. Nord ensures that the data receipt matches in agreements. They review PHI. They reformat the data structure and files and extract the metadata. RDCA then re-extracts the metadata, continues to annotate it. We reformat the data structure and files, create the data catalogs and dictionaries, and we standardize those data elements. So there's some overlap between what the two groups are doing, but there's also our own unique roles that really make this part of that team sport, where we're all playing on the same field, but we also are specializing in different components here. And just to give an example of what the endpoint of this is, where we are able to publish this data. This is an example of the data dictionary where we've annotated what are the column names, field names that exist, what are the labels of those, what was the question actually presented to the patient or caregiver. And in case that they're given a drop down or some kind of multiple select option, will give you what that coded value is and what all the possible options were the patient was presented with. So you know this is what they selected out of these possibilities. And we also annotate these things with like response time as well, where we try to make it very clear, was this a submission time or was this how long it took for them to respond to the questionnaire. So just kind of summarize the focus on the data stewardship is really connecting patients to the researchers, and the mechanism that we utilize is shared IM relationship with RDCA-Data. And so the patient is able to provide their data, the caregiver provides their data to the registries and to the registry groups. Nord facilitates the curation and standardization of that data. They steward it and act as the custodian that passes it to the RDCA-Data. RDCA-Data further curates that data and provides it to researchers, where we're able to make that available. With that, I think I'll say thank you, and we can move to the Q&A panel.
Great, thank you so much, Will and Casey. We really appreciate that, that presentation. So at this point, we're going to shift to our Q&A panel. So we will have Casey and Will available for questions, and we do have a few questions coming in, but I'd also like to invite Vicki Thoyer-Kreider to come on camera and join us for the panel. So Vicki is our Senior Project Manager in our Data Collaboration Center at C-Path and works very closely with us and Will and Casey on the RDCA DAP program. And so we'll join or invite the three of them here. And I know we have a few questions coming through, so we'll go ahead and address a couple of those now. And I invite anyone who's online to type in some questions in the Q&A so we can get to them. So the first question is a bit of a question, but also something that we'll follow up on. So I see a question in here from Christine, who is the founder and president of Rare Together Worldwide, which is a patient advocacy organization for ultra-rare spinocerebellar ataxia. And I just wanted to acknowledge that note in the question and answer. And we do work on ataxias, and we do have talked about and might be starting some work in the spinocerebellar ataxia space specifically. So we will make sure to follow up with you, Christine, so that we can connect and find out some ways that we might be able to collaborate or how we might work together. So if you don't mind putting your contact information, an email or something in the Q&A so that we can make sure to follow up with you directly after the call. So we appreciate that. And we are, let's see what other questions we have. So here's a question coming in. Is there a data platform better than others for collecting rare disease natural history data? Whether that's IAMRARE, Genetic Alliance, /Luna DNA platform, or any others. So I'll open that question up. Maybe Casey, you can start in terms of from the IAMRARE perspective or NORD perspective, but certainly we can talk about, you know, data platforms for collecting rare disease, natural history in general.
So being at NORD, we obviously have the IAMRARE platform. So I don't want to make it sound like I'm biased or anything, but it really does depend on what you're looking for and where you are kind of in your journey in developing your registry, your natural history studies. So some of these organizations, obviously, depending on pricing, depending on size, depending on what you are looking for, some of these organizations do help you in providing surveys, core libraries. We have our core library to be able to get you started, and some of these organizations kind of stick to that and establish their standards in that way. Whereas other organizations, us included, if you have custom surveys, we do help you to develop them and applying other standards that we know of for analysis and shareability and all those great things that we already talked about. But it really does depend on what you're looking for, where you are in your journey, and kind of what best fits for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, so I'm the C-Path end, we work with platforms agnostically. We're not too concerned about one or the other. And there's lots of pros and cons. It really depends on the data type that you're interested in and what your needs community are. There can be things that drive decisions, like maybe you're really Android friendly users and you want to make sure that you have something that's on the Google store. And these decisions that end up getting made or sometimes seem a little bit arbitrary, but you have to weigh lots of pros and cons to understand what's the best thing that you can do with your patients and make sure that you're capturing data that's important to them. And so I encourage you to try to work with each of these groups and understand what the pros and cons are. Everything from cost down to what you upload the data that you're interested in.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we had another question about opportunities to collaborate between RDCA DAP and other data networks, such as rare disease specific federated networks, like, I'm not sure how to pronounce this, but Federation with a PH. And so I can just mention that we are, and then I can open it up for anyone else on the panel to address this, but we are looking at different ways that we can have federated access. We're not doing that currently, but we've been investigating that with various partners. So we hope that we are looking towards opportunities for those in the future and are open to those conversations, certainly. And then I can open that up if there's anything else that anyone on the panel would like to add to that.
Yeah, I think this kind of is something that we're interested in. One thing that we're keen on is understanding what is the sort of value add and what is the use case for that situation. One of the advantages here of CA-DAP is that we do host the data for you. And so we provide that long-term reusable and interoperable space and ensure that the data is in our platform. So we have a really strong focus on letting people use the data inside of this environment and not taking it somewhere else. So federation does seem like something that would be interesting. But the kind of details of what is a specific use case where we're able to push this further is one of the things that we want to make sure that we get right, rather than just implementing a federated API for the sake of implementing it. So it's some of the discussions that are happening here.
Great, thank you, Will. Okay, so another question here from Chris. Can you share some basic metrics or drop a link in the chat, number of data sets, amount of data, number of data requests, resulting publications? So I'm assuming that's a question about some basic metrics currently for RDCA-DAP and kind of what we're doing here. And we can absolutely share that information out to everyone on this call and directly with you, Chris, so we can follow up. We can follow up on that and make sure you have the most current information of what we're doing here. Okay, another question for the panel. Can you discuss how you have found a solution to more broadly share data when patient advocacy groups and leaders want to receive data sets themselves? Okay, so it sounds like this is kind of a, how do we work to, have data coming into RDCA-DAP when people are looking to receive that data. So I can start off with, and then again, anyone from the panel can also jump in. One of the great things about RDCA-DAP is that ability to aggregate the data from many different sources in specific rare diseases, or not specific, any rare disease really. But one of the benefits to our platform is having varied data sets available to review together. So, while patient advocacy groups and registries have their own data sets that they're looking at, one of the benefits to then providing that to us is being able to, review multiple data sets together. And so that's really one of the benefits and how we, collaborate or what one of the value adds to RDCA-DAP versus just having the data in-house in a specific registry, and then having that ability to control kind of what's done with that data and how people use that data, which is what the DAP also provides, as well as the tools to do some of that that work. So I'll open it up if Casey and Will or Vicky have anything they want to add to that.
Well, I do see a follow-up question from that same commenter, Leanne, clarifying her question around the patient advocacy group members receiving the curated version back, it sounds like, to kind of help with some of those compliance and responsible use issues that we talked about during the webinar. And contributors absolutely can access their own data from within the DAP, and that's available to them within the workspaces of the platform to do that research and analysis like you were discussing, Laura. And then sometimes we do also have that as part of the negotiation, right? Where the contributor can get themselves just like a local copy or whatever back to themselves and to whatever group. So if NORD or the patient advocacy group from which that data came, returning it back then to that particular group. So there are several ways where the final product of that data, that curated data, can once again be utilized and retrieved.
So I can add to that. So if the, at least with NORD, with our registries, so any of the members of the patient advocacy group, we can designate permission. So anybody who needs to access the information within your group or related to your group, you can designate different permissions for what they can see, when they can see it, all of those types of different things. So if they are a part of your patient advocacy group, but they just need to see, some of the response answers without identifiers, we can remove them right from the beginning. And all of the data sets for those organizations belong to the organizations and to the people establishing the registries. So they can always access their raw data if they have the appropriate permissions to do so. And then, as Vicki said, you would be able to look at the curated data sets to kind of compare and see, what came over and what is being decided to come over, what you decide to share. Each organization goes through their surveys and can designate which ones they'd like to share or which ones they would think are valuable. It's not really an all or none type of thing. We definitely work together with everybody to, again, ensure that all perspectives are taken into consideration and that we're doing this in a way that makes everybody happy and is useful to everybody. Well, I don't know if you want to add to.
Yeah, you guys you hit all the points I already mentioned.
Great. Okay, so another question. Do you have recommendations on how to connect data at the individual patient level? Do you suggest that different data holders apply the same GUID mechanism, or have patients hold a research ID that they can share with registries they participate in and request that their ID is added to their records? Anyone have any specific thoughts on this?
Easy.
So for the NORD registries, we are collecting the information that would, it's a part of the participant profile to generate an NIH GUID. So that's what we were going with. We collect the information, but you don't necessarily have to generate one if you don't want to. But if you moved in that direction, we would have all of the information to start to standardize some of those things and provide it.
In general, RDC does not have a recommendation on that exactly. But we are interested in, what that might look like for the rare disease space. But because we're not involved in data collection, that's typically something that we're making a recommendation on. And we don't collect any patient identifiers that we share. It is de-identified, so we don't have that data that you just described.
Great, thank you. Okay, so a couple more questions that we're going through here. So I love all the questions coming through, so keep them coming. Can you share some more information on the swim lane concept on maturing the metadata?
Yeah, I can. So that was a really interesting exercise when we developed these swim lanes. So what we realized is that we were already kind of doing this in practice, but that what we wanted to do was formalize it in part just to document our own processes, but then also to make it easier to do training. And so the idea of these sort of swim lanes is that you have different teammates that may be in different departments. So the key ones that we think about are our data contributors, IMR or any other data contributor. We have our data platform team that actually supports infrastructure related components. So they help make sure that we have all of the right security and cloud infrastructure in place. We have our data engineering team and data science teams that help provide more of the tooling and software around these things. We move the data from point A to point B. We have a data management team that actually works on the details of that data. And then we have our legal and compliance teams to help negotiate the contracts. And so one of the components there is that when you have all of these people that become very specialized, you also have to make sure they're communicating in a clear fashion. So the people that are working on the contracts need to negotiate down to the infrastructure team, where should the data be stored, would be in the EU. The infrastructure team communicates that back to the engineering team, so we make sure that what we're deploying actually works. And then it goes all the way back down to the level of the data manager. Once they actually get into the data themselves, they may have feedback loops where they go back up to the data contributor with additional questions that may result in additional data being shared or additional metadata being transferred. And so the concept there is really just being able to describe what are those decision points and where is it that we're moving between these teams and making sure that we're really on the same page.
Great, thank you. Here's another question on metadata. So how can we optimize metadata to ensure that the intent and context of the data is understood to have the same meaning by all stakeholders?
So I can start on that one. When I would advocate for data standards early and often, the more that we can do to agree on a data standard ahead of time, the better. And I know that can be really difficult, especially when there isn't a data standards in like that disease space. So sometimes it's a challenge when maybe the disease name itself is so rare that it isn't part of the standardized terminology. But the more that we can adopt those standards, the easier it is to make these things clear. The other thing is that if we're able to eliminate things like free text fields, that's one area where it's really challenging. We may have a free text field, and we may have a question on any other comments. Sometimes it's really helpful data in there, but it takes a lot of work to be able to extract any value from that, and it can be really biased. But if we're able to understand from input and caregivers and patient groups what is the important components of this disease, maybe we can identify some data standards or some standardized questionnaires where it's a little bit more structured, and then we're clearer on the intent of that when it comes time to actually do the analysis than if we were working with the free text field, for example.
I would agree with all of that. And in trying to initially develop the studies and the surveys with the patient organizations, again, we do have a core and some validated surveys that we usually recommend. But, you know, with some of these diseases, you don't know what you don't know. So it doesn't mean that it isn't going to take some exploratory learning, hopefully with some guided questions to be able to, you know, develop surveys that would be helpful later. But as Will said, if you do need to incorporate some free text fields to be able to provide that context, which can be very important for learning about disease progression, it doesn't mean we can't include those and make sure that in some way we're able to look at those together and ensure that they're analyzed in a way that's useful and helpful to inform later studies and surveys.
And the data centers themselves. That's a great area where we're seeing a need for it, and there's something there. Maybe we don't have enough detail to develop the data center, but we can start somewhere and help that to drive those standardizations.
Great, thanks. Okay, another question that maybe is a little bit related to that. Does NORD or C-Path help identify what might be valuable data for the RDCA DAP, i.e. published drug repurposing trials? So I can start off and just say that part of what we do with RDCA DAP when we meet with potential contributors is discuss, you know, the data that they have, what that looks like. We are happy to take a look at some of the data to kind of see what's there and give some feedback if there is already data available. And then one of the great things about our program and receiving all of these different data sets from different organizations is that we can then start to identify maybe where some gaps are in the data that is out there or that we're receiving, and then try to help, you know, give some of that feedback on for new people who are starting registries or who are starting participating in trials or getting those going, and kind of looking at making sure that they're gathering the types of data that would be helpful and beneficial as part of the DAP and drug discovery in general. So I guess that was a long answer to say, yes, we do some of that. We're always happy to have those conversations. And then I'll open it up for other comments from the panel.
One other comment that I'll make is that although we do what everything the Lord just said, we also don't want to stifle innovation. So we try not to be too biased because we don't know what's important. And one of the aspects of good data stewardship and in ensuring the long-term use of this data is that we also recognize people put time and effort into this data. And so the more that we can do to kind of really extract value out of that, whether it be the cost of running a clinical trial or just the human time of responding to a survey, we don't know what the value of that data set is, and maybe it's not valuable today, but it could be valuable in the future in combination with other data that becomes collected later. And so we try not to be too biased, but we also recognize that there are priorities and we have to start somewhere, and that's why we do follow one of the what it's just describing.
Great. Okay. So I see a question here about if what collaboration, if any, we have with NICHD natural history data. So would have to look at that. I'm not sure that we have anything right at the moment, but of course we're always looking to form more collaborations and explore those opportunities. So we're definitely open to that and always looking for more of those things. So we'll definitely take a look at that. Okay, so what barriers to knowledge discovery and innovation in rare diseases can be reduced by good data stewardship?
I think the first one that comes to mind is just having the data that is so one of the challenges with knowledge discovery is getting access to the data and making sure that you get access to the right data. I think the good data stewardship really addresses that, which seems like sort of an obvious thing at the top level. But like I think a lot of times if you neglect the data stewardship plan, it's too easy to not be able to either get the data, or when you do get the data, you can't make any sense out of it. So good data stewardship really helps enable those components.
I think, as we mentioned before too, the iterative process, being able to look at all the data, being able to look at all of the different surveys and registries that we have helped to build, have helped to collect information from, and learning, does this work? Does this question work? Are we getting the valuable information that we need, rather than having to, test a question and then they have to answer a full survey again because we didn't make it concise, we didn't make it to design it to be able to get to the answers that we're actually looking for. So being able to, as Will said, standardize and be helpful without stifling that innovation, being able to get some of these data sources and making them valuable to all parties, to the people submitting them, to the people analyzing them, and looking at them as well too.
Great, thank you. Okay, so another question here. Do data stewardship considerations change in an environment where multiple data sets can be combined?
I think there are some, so this is an interesting question that we do grapple with, because when you have a single data set, the data may be kind of considered anonymized, depending on what features are there. And you may have to remove more data, but maybe if you move that data into a larger data set where you have a larger pool of patients, now it's kind of further anonymized. So this kind of context issue of like the anonymization within the granularity of the data set is a real challenge when we think about anonymity. And so that's something that we do think a lot about. And I don't know that we have a perfect answer. I don't know, it's a perfect answer, but it's not a C-Path issue. It's an issue for everyone. But I think that it is something that's really worth thinking about.
I'm not sure that I have anything else to add. I mean, it really is very complex depending on where the data sets are coming from, depending on who is looking at the data sets. If you have somebody who is contributing from Sweden, but the person who's looking at the data lives in France, then, so that's probably a bad example because they're both in Europe, but it may vary on that. But also, as you said, combining some of this information together. So depending on what their data dictionary looks like, what information is being collected and how, just a few words within a question could kind of make that difference between the answers that they provide. I know that translations is a big issue as well too. So we actually have made a big push to offer surveys and translations in our platform and translations, because it is very important. It is very different how you present those questions to anybody, and how it's going to be analyzed and aggregated together.
Yeah, that's actually a great point about sort of the questionnaires, and like especially anything that is considered valid and has been evaluated for a set of questions. If you change the wording on one of those, or you remove one, then that can change how you calculate the final score and the validity of the instrument. And so from kind of a psychometrics perspective, it is important that you understand that people are following what the standards, what's going on. And I know that can feel kind of frustrating, especially if you really don't care about one of those questions, you don't want to ask it, but then it's going to make it harder to compare two scores between two different data sets.
Great. Okay, I know we have just a couple more minutes left, but maybe we can get to one or two more questions here. So regarding data standardization, do you use OMOP CDM or a different model?
Yes, so we do use the OMOP common data model as our target common data model. When Nord and C-Path exchange data, we do it in a format that's sort of unique to us. It's our own thing. And we've done that for a number of reasons, but our data curators standardize that data to the OMOP CDM. We also apply ontologies so that we can move beyond what OMOP offers. And it's not to say that we're only focused on OMOP. That's just our first starting place. So if data was needed in SCTM or another CDM, we're really keen on offering translations between all of those standards. And we have experience with many of them. But OMOP seems to be pretty friendly for a lot of these data, especially things that are coming out of registry. So that's where we tend to start.
We're doing the same as well. We're moving towards OMOP and CDM, making sure that we're trying to structure in that manner, obviously, because we're working with C-Path, but also a lot of the EHRs are kind of structured and use a lot of those elements. So being able to import some of that information and incorporate it into this natural history information that we're collecting is very, very valuable.
Great. Thank you guys so much. Okay, there were a couple other questions that we didn't have time for. I think we'll go ahead and stop here, but we can follow up offline with any other questions. And I know there were a couple people who dropped in some contact information that we can follow up with some further conversations about potential collaboration. So as we wrap up, just want to mention that this was our final in the 2022 RDCA DAP webinar series, but we are already busy planning our 2023 webinar series. So save the dates for March 16th, April 20th, June 22nd, July 20th, October 19th, and November 16th. Hopefully anyone who is on the call today has signed up for our newsletter, the RDCA DAP newsletter. So you know, we have information highlighting what we're working on and some of those statistics that were mentioned earlier in the call. So if you haven't signed up for that, I encourage you to do that. And then also just watch your email for invitations for our upcoming webinars. We hope you join us. So the March webinar will be, our first one of the year will be clinical outcome assessments. Does one size fit all? So if clinical outcome assessments are of interest, make sure you watch for that registration coming soon. So once again, thank you everyone for joining us today. We appreciate you taking your time, and we wish you all a happy holiday season and look forward to great work in 2023 together. So thank you.